Hi, my name's Caitlin McDonald, and I study ecological conservation. And as part of the Community Service Learning Program at the University of Alberta, we are working with the Regional Environmental Action Committee on the Plastics Remanufacture Project. Today, we are interviewing Jessica Lajoie. Jessica is an impact investment specialist with the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation, and we really appreciate her help to try and work out a new protocol for GHG emission credits in regards to recycling plastic in remote, rural, and Indigenous communities. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Caitlin.
Can you please briefly explain for our viewers what GHG emission credits are?
Of course, and they go by a few names, which isn't helpful. So sometimes they're called carbon offsets or carbon credits, but essentially what all those terms mean is the measurement and verification of an action that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in one place that can then be quantified and sold or traded to counteract against other emissions that are occurring in another place or within another company or structure. So that's basically how they work. What we usually measure greenhouse gas quantification in is called tons of CO2 equivalent. So you'll often hear emission credits being reported in tons.
Okay, awesome. How did you get started in this field? What was your inspiration?
Yeah, I was really lucky in around 2008, 2009 to join a company that was working on developing greenhouse gas offset projects in Alberta. And the impetus for that company doing that was because Alberta was one of the first jurisdictions, or maybe the first jurisdiction in North America, to have an operating trading system for greenhouse gas credits. I was really interested in working in the climate change field, and it really aligned well with my background, which is in environmental engineering and the technical work going into how to measure and quantify those greenhouse gas emission reductions. I learned a lot at that position, and we were able to develop new protocols or methodologies, which is what we call the guidance document that tells you very specifically what to measure and how to calculate greenhouse gas emission reductions or emission credits from a certain activity or project. And then we also were able to do some projects in Alberta that required us to collect all the data, calculate everything to register and verify those greenhouse gas emission credits. So working the right place, the right time, and being in Alberta when that was happening, and learning, globally, there were other emission reduction programs in place that we relied on and drew from a little bit, but we were really at the forefront of developing Alberta's system at that time. It was really exciting.
Amazing. So what are some key concepts or principles used in GHG emission credit accounting?
Yeah, there's a really commonly referred to ISO standard protocol for greenhouse gas different stages of quantification and analysis for projects. And that standard, it's called ISO 14064, the one related to quantification, does lay out some very key high-level principles that I think it's important to refer back to, and which did form the basis of the Alberta system that I was trained in all those years ago. So I'll quickly go through some of them. They're self-explanatory for the most part, but again, it's really important to remember these principles that all quantification or emission credits should be based on. So they are relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, transparency, and conservativeness. And I can pick out one or two and that I think are really important. So that last one, conservativeness, I always take that one to heart, and it's really up to the person doing the quantification to live these principles. So conservativeness is when you don't know or don't have exact data, or maybe there's a range of values and you can't narrow it down. You always pick the data or the percentage or the factor that will give you the lower estimate of credits to generate. So we never ever want to overestimate how many credits or over state what the impact of a project is. So you might be understating, but that's just accepted as that's fine if you're missing some, but you want to make sure the ones that you are recording are accurate and legitimate. And as well, some of those other aspects go along with that. So transparency, we always want to state where our sources come from, state all our assumptions, state when we're making assumptions versus having actual data. And completeness is counting all the different sources that might be impacting a project. So often you hear about an activity that's happening and they say, oh, we're going to, save greenhouse gas emissions by doing this one thing here. But maybe somewhere else you've actually changed someone else's behavior that has increased greenhouse gas emissions. So you need to draw those boundaries to say we are counting, we are complete in our assessment, whether it's upstream manufacturing emissions or downstream disposal emissions or increased or decreased transportation involved. Like there's, that's usually called like a life cycle analysis. So we need to be complete and not just look at a very narrow lens and say that, oh, we can say we're reducing emissions because we're only looking at a smaller piece. So I like to come back to those principles. And one that's not in that list that I will add as well is something called additionality. And that is open for interpretation through a lot of different systems. But essentially, what additionality means is we only want to provide a greenhouse gas offset credit or emission credit when an activity would not have otherwise been done. So that can be for several reasons. And you can actually, there's several ways you could show additionality. So one way might be financial additionality. So we assume in our marketplace that people are going to do actions that might save them money or be cheaper than an alternative. Often when we're looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there's an added cost for people to put in a new system or put in new technology. So we say that there's a financial barrier, and by adding a carbon credit, you're closing that barrier, and therefore that action is additional. It wouldn't have occurred without that carbon credit being there. Another good form of additionality is regulatory. So if the regulations in a given jurisdiction say, in 5 years, we expect you to reduce your emissions by 20%, you're required to do that. Anything that you do to meet that regulation is not going to count for a greenhouse gas emission credit because you would have had to do that anyway. So the entire process is really this imagining a future that might be business as usual is a common term for it. If we didn't change anything today, what would it look like? What would our emissions be? And what are we doing differently that will change that outcome that we can actually claim is a reduction credit? Hopefully
Right.
that's
Okay.
helpful.
Yeah. So how does the GHG credit market work? I know you've already kind of touched on that a little, but if you could explain, please.
Yeah, I think there's two main types of markets that we should discuss because they're very different. So broadly, I categorize them into the voluntary market and the regulatory or mandatory market. So most people are probably very familiar with, I think, the voluntary market. Sometimes you go to buy an airplane ticket and it says, would you like to offset your carbon emissions? And you maybe click a box and then you say, okay, I'm buying credits to counteract the emissions from this flight. So there's that's one example. There's also a lot of industries that might say we are going to voluntarily give ourselves a net zero target and we will buy emission credits in order so we can meet that target. So the biggest difference, I think, is obvious, is that the momentum or the impetus for people to buy credits or companies is from their own internal decision to do so versus the regulated or mandatory market where some authority, probably the local government, will set a level of greenhouse gas emissions as a target, and say, you need to meet this level. You can meet it through reducing your emissions, or if that's not possible or economical, you may go and buy emission credits from somewhere else in order to meet this target that we have set for you. In which case, there's often a lot more scrutiny and you know, structure to how those credits are going to be measured. Not to say that the voluntary market doesn't have standards. There are many methodologies out there, and there are groups that do validate and verify. And I think as we all learn and grow through the carbon credit system, those we're learning what makes more verifiable and validated voluntary offset credits as well. So the systems are growing and getting better, I think, as people use them. But there is more scrutiny on the mandatory markets to start. And the voluntary markets, I often say the devil is in the details. So you need to know what is being purchased and what standard or mechanism they're measuring those and verifying those offset credits against. So essentially, if we think about those two markets, you typically have a buyer and a seller. So the buyer will be, whatever their motivation is, whether it's regulatory or voluntary, be looking to purchase an amount of credits. Usually we go by calendar year. So they might say, oh, for the year 2023, I need to buy X number of credits in order to meet my obligation. And within that, they have then options of where to fulfill that demand for those credits. So that can be there can be trading markets, there can be unofficial markets where there's a registry where people can post their projects, and maybe behind the scenes there's negotiations happening. Often it's pretty confidential between companies, like how much they're spending, what the details of those agreements are. So there's it's hard to maybe say overarching what is the price or something that you might get for an offset. There's so many factors that go into it. Sometimes a buyer will do what we call forward purchasing. So they might say, hey, we really like this project that you're trying to do or going to do. We will forward buy the next 10 years of your emission credits and you agree on a price. And that is great for that project developer. It can give them a lot of certainty. There's risk, of course, anytime you're looking out into the future, because you're saying maybe the price goes way up and now you've locked in at a lower price or something. But there's many, many ways that those actual interactions between buyer and seller can work. But essentially, yes, you've got a market with supply on one side and demand on the other side, and all the different factors that go into that.
Very cool. Okay. Can you give us an idea of the range of different projects that can provide GHG emission credit funding? And to whom does the funding go?
Yeah, so I can talk about Alberta because, like I said, we have a regulated trading system in Alberta. So there's very clear project types that are eligible to generate offset credits. When this system started, there was a lot of focus on agriculture and different practices in farming and livestock rearing that would result in greenhouse gas emission reductions. There's a lot around waste, which is interesting for the REAC project that we're talking about, because when waste goes to a landfill, often methane is created, and that is a very potent greenhouse gas. So, you can reduce that by composting or by landfilling or treating the waste differently. So there are a few different actions there that could be generating greenhouse gas credits. As well, there are a few related to different aspects of our oil and gas industry. So there might be injection, like the oil and gas industry. People might be aware of carbon capture and sequestration, where you're putting CO2 back underground. But there are already practices in industry where they might do that for other reasons. So they could capture maybe a portion of their emission reductions if it's additional from some of those activities. And as well, we have some protocols around renewable energy generation, of course, so solar and wind. There's a very generic one for building efficiency. So if you are improving maybe the insulation or operation of a building and reducing your energy use that way, you can possibly get credits from that. So yeah, there's a whole gamut. What Alberta doesn't have, which a lot of people might be familiar with, are nature-based solution or maybe forestry-related credits. A lot of more global systems for generating offset credits look at avoided things like avoided deforestation. So that might take the frame of somewhere where deforestation is a very common practice and happening at a certain rate. If you can, purchase or put a hold on an area of land that was slated to be deforested and say now the economic activity from deforesting is going to be replaced by the economic activity from maintaining that carbon, that is a potential carbon or offset project type, or repopulating lands that have been deforested if there was no plan to do so. That, putting in more, the forest is like a general term that it could take a few different forms, but essentially recapturing natural or biogenic carbon in an area where there was once some that had been removed and maybe there was no plans or no availability to reforest or repopulate an area with its previous habitat or biodiversity. So yeah, that's probably some of the ones that most people are familiar with.
Okay, and sorry, to whom does the funding go?
Oh yes, thank you for that one. So again, I'm sort of back to the market idea. It depends on every specific deal, but ideally, in the reason carbon credits exist is you're really trying to incentivize that project developer or that activity. So the majority of the funding or the purchase price or whatever money is being paid for the carbon offsets ideally should go to the project developer to help them do more of what they're doing and reduce more greenhouse gas emissions that way. Again, it depends specifically on the case in point and how that has been negotiated, but it would be a big red flag if that wasn't happening, because that would mean the mechanisms aren't actually being used the way they are. So yeah, short answer would be ideally, there's always going to be some administrative fees or something like that, but you would want to see most of the funding flow or the cost flow, not the cost, the revenue, the benefit flow to that person or that group actually doing the reduction project.
Amazing. Okay, so in your expert opinion, does the GHG credit market really help us to reduce GHGs?
Great question. I have wrestled with this internally, my whole career in doing this work. And ultimately, the answer is like a lot of nuanced answers is that it depends. So the specific rules and oversight of a carbon credit system are what will eventually tell you what the impact will be. So if you have clear reviews and third parties checking that things are working as they're supposed to, that all those principles I talked about earlier, that those are being followed properly and adhered to, then I'm comfortable saying that we're really just using an economic indicator like the price on carbon to drive activity that we want to see, which is reducing emissions, often somewhere where it's not economical to do so, or it's not, it wouldn't otherwise be done. So we are just using that very common pricing that we see in our markets all the time to drive behavior or outcomes that we want to see by adding a price to something. So from that, outside idea, putting a price on carbon simply should change behavior and change priorities within certain aspects of the market. But to really drive, are we creating an impact, and are the impacts that are being reported the right scale and the right amount? that really comes down to how well that system, like I said, is managed, what kind of oversight there is, what kind of um, the different actors in the system, because you'll have your buyer, you have your seller, and then you have your registry, or maybe your in between marketer that is trading. They're like, the platform that is trading the credits. They all need to be motivated to have high impact as, and not making money as their motivation for doing that work. And often I think what's come out in the last few years is that reputational risks of not doing it properly can really impact it. So I think we've turned a corner on a lot of carbon offset projects and claims, because initially I think a lot of people were willing to make the claims without doing the deeper dive work or making sure that all those checks and balances were in place. And it did come back, to be a bit critical of some of the systems, which is fair. That's the system working, right? We want to be able to call things out and say, hey, this practice isn't correct, or you claimed this, but when we went and actually looked, that wasn't actually happening. So I don't think that those hiccups in any way negate the fundamental benefit of what carbon offset systems can do. And ultimately, we'll just keep getting better and better at really measuring that impact. And from an overall perspective, I would say we need to accept that in order to make a difference, in order to be additional and pay for carbon offsets that are going to yield an impact, a real impact, and the results we want, they can't be $1 a ton. Like, I think that was part of the issue, is we were sold this idea that we could offset our activities for very cheap price and all was good. So I would say that's another red flag. If offsets or carbon credits are too cheap, you have to question what is the actual impact you could make with that little bit of money, right? So I think there's a bit of intuition and practicality that you can apply if you're looking to buy your own voluntary carbon offsets, or decide the value or the impact of carbon offsets that a company is claiming, or someone else.
Amazing. So thank you so much for your time, Jessica. That was all of the questions that I have for you today. Really appreciate the insight into the GHG credit market.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caitlin. This was really fun. I'm always happy to talk about carbon credits.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure that you like, subscribe, and check out our other videos here on the REAC YouTube channel. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.